Experts believe the nearly 5-month-long ban on tobacco sales could leave an unintended legacy that may long last into the foreseeable future. Dominant producers like British American Tobacco have lost market share to the black market. What does the lifting of the ban, however, mean for the balance of power within the industry, and who exactly stands to win and lose? Telita Snyckers is an expert on how the illegal cigarette trade market operates. She joins me live now from Denmark. Good evening, Telita. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Firstly, let's just talk about the illegal market, because in many respects, I suppose it's a case of some players, the main players, have now lost out on what they would have generally been benefiting from in the illegal market to smaller players.
Well, absolutely. So when we look at the market share in South Africa, the legal players before the ban, of course, would have, stood to make sales, as they did before the ban. And what we've seen is that instead, especially some of the low-cost manufacturers have really capitalized on the situation, and where BAT, before the ban, held a market share of around 75%. Now, as a result of the ban, BAT's market share is down to only around 9%, with the rest of the market now being controlled by, some of the smaller, local, low-cost manufacturers.
I suppose it's a bad thing for British American Tobacco, but is it a bad thing for local manufacturers of tobacco, who I imagine before this point would have struggled to get a foot in the door?
Well, absolutely. So we know that some of the local low-cost manufacturers have in the past tried to take BAT on because they said that BAT had effectively had a monopoly and that it was extremely difficult for some of the smaller low-cost manufacturers to compete. But at the same time, we also know that there are a number of allegations against some of the smaller low-cost manufacturers deliberately supplying the illicit market. Of course, we should also say that there are also allegations of BAT's own hands, being dirty to some extent. And so absolutely, this would have been a fantastic opportunity for some of the smaller manufacturers who maybe have fewer scruples and who had easier access to some of these illicit supply chains to really get a foot in the door and to claim some of the market share that BAT had held before the ban.
Telita, I suppose the bigger issue here is the extent to which the illicit cigarette or tobacco market is being allowed to operate in the way that it has in this country over decades. And the fact that there can be research done on it, the fact that somebody like you can have the kind of data that you do on the market, says that people know what's happening, but not enough will to actually bring it to an end.
Well, absolutely. So one of the reasons why we saw illicit trade before the ban, and one of the reasons why we saw illicit trade booming during the ban, is because the way that we regulate the tobacco supply chain in South Africa is actually really weak. So we have virtually no production controls in place in South Africa. So in effect, we rely on the cigarette manufacturers to tell us how many packs they made. If we find a pack in a supermarket or in a spaza shop or in somebody's boot, we have absolutely no way of knowing whether tax was paid on that pack or not. So we're not securely marking tax-paid packs. We also have no way to trace packs back to the manufacturer. And so the systemic weaknesses that we have across the board are what makes illicit trade in tobacco and in other excisable products really thrive in South Africa. And those systemic weaknesses haven't suddenly disappeared after the ban was lifted. So we'll see, illicit trade continuing the way it was.
Let's talk comparatively, perhaps before the lockdown, because that might be a fairer picture. The legal market versus the illegal market, where is the most money being made?
Well, so before the lockdown ban, we know that approximately 35% of the local market was illicit. And so that's 35% of cigarette packs on which SARS saw no tax income and that were being sold off the books. So 65% of the packs that were being sold, at least SARS saw some of the money. But we also have to remember that that's only one small part of what we are losing from tobacco evasion. So we also know that another way for companies to cheat would be for things like transfer pricing or using more sophisticated, aggressive tax evasion schemes. And so it's not just the excise duty that we're losing on the packs that are being sold on the black market, but it's also the bigger tax loss that we're seeing from the cigarette industry as a whole.
But of course, not having access or freely available tobacco during the lockdown has also helped people become creative. Let's talk about the loose tobacco or the roll your own market that seems to be blooming in South Africa, again, as a result of that stringent lockdown and that tobacco ban.
Absolutely. So I think South Africans are very good at adapting themselves to situations. Before the lockdown ban, the roll your own market was actually relatively small. But what we saw under the ban is, people were willing to firstly start smoking brands that they never would have considered before the lockdown. But the other thing we saw was that tobacco farmers were actually advertising their products that they could courier to smokers and who could then roll their own cigarettes. And what happened was that so many South Africans then discovered that it's actually seemingly a pleasurable activity and it's far cheaper than buying cigarettes. And so, I think we'll see more and more smokers actually going for a roll your own type of cigarette simply because it's cheaper. And one of the challenges with that is it's reasonably easy to regulate the cigarette supply chain, but it's actually quite difficult to regulate loose tobacco. And so if more South Africans move to the roll your own market, it poses a more substantial challenge from a regulation perspective.
So what does this mean ultimately, I guess, for the country? Because the only way that South Africans then really benefit from the trade of tobacco is through the money that the revenue collector is able to get at the end of the day.
Well, yes, but, even there's a bit of smoke and mirrors in that argument, because the healthcare costs from smoking-related diseases in South Africa costs government around 59 billion rand every year. And if you take, a company like British American Tobacco, their tax contribution is only 14 billion. And so there's a huge gap between the healthcare costs and the money that the country actually collects in taxes from the tobacco industry. And so, yes, we can say that they contribute taxes, but it nowhere near compensates for the costs from smoking. And so, over time, we need to, of course, be sensitive to people who work in the tobacco industry. But I think we need to do far more about conversations about what smoking is costing the country, as opposed to saying that at least they're contributing, some taxes to the economy.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. A former SARS lawyer and author of Dirty Tobacco, Spies, Lies and Mega Profits, Telita Snyckers.